to vote in Russia. Let's see, I can vote for Vladimir Putin, V. Putin, Big Papa Putin, just Putin, or anybody pro-democracy. I think it's time for a change.
In this video, I want to talk to you about the Middle East as a whole, which is a collection of many countries, and Russia. Two areas, two regions, Middle East with many countries, and Russia, just the single country, that appear in the news a lot and have a lot to do with our foreign relations, and I want to give you some background. So make sure you look at the notes for this one, because particularly the Middle East notes, there's going to be a lot that I don't cover in the video, simply because I don't want the video to be half an hour long, which we'll see how long it ends up being in the end anyway. So, the Middle East, it's made up of a lot of different places, and this is a generalization of a pretty big country. It's like, it's like saying a very large region is one thing. It's not always one thing, but you can speak in some generalities. So, a lot of the Middle East is very arid, which is more like a desert kind of climate that you might think of. A lot of it is bad for farming. And so it is. It's a tougher existence than exists in other places, because that ability to raise your own food crops is more limited in the area. Much of the area suffers under some pretty harsh rulers. Going back again, there's a lot of theocracies here. There's a lot of dictatorships here, and there's monarchies here. Very little in the way of democracy or anything like that. So the governments are much more strict and authoritarian than those of Europe or America, Canada, etc. So there are a lot of religious conflicts in the Middle East. There are different sects of Muslims who don't agree with how to practice their own faith. This is, of course, the birthplace of Judaism and Christianity as well. And there is a lot of conflict because of all that shared heritage in one very localized region. So, a few definitions for you. Arab is something you've probably heard of before, but a lot of people use Arab as if it's interchangeable with Muslim, and it's not. A lot of Arab people are Muslim, but Arab is a race/ethnicity, whereas Muslim is a religion. Not all Arabs are Muslim. So Muslim, religion, Arab, race/ethnicity. So what am I including in the Middle East? This is a lot of the countries that you think of, like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, all of those countries, but also a lot of the countries in North Africa. I would include in a discussion about the Middle East, even though it's not really that same region. And the reason I would include those is because culturally there's a lot that's shared between those countries, and mostly because of how heavily Islamic or Muslim they are. So Northern Africa and then the Middle East, like I said, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and those other countries that are in this area. Moving on, a mosque. You might have heard this term before. A mosque is simply their place of worship for Muslims. It's church, synagogue, same kind of thing. So a mosque is just their place of worship. There are many different famous places in the Middle East that have to do with Judaism, Christianity, and the Muslim faith. I just don't have time to go over all those, so I'm going to skip some of those. Make sure you look at those in the notes. But I will mention the Kaaba, because that's something that you might not have heard of that's very, very important to Islam. The 5 pillars of Islam, in fact, one of them is the Hajj, which is a pilgrimage, a journey that you're supposed to take to Mecca to visit the Kaaba. And the Kaaba is a rock which supposedly Muhammad sat upon as he was given his revelations. And so every Muslim is supposed to go visit the Kaaba. Let's see. So, like I said, there's a lot of very meaningful religious sites not only for Muslims but also for Jews and Christians in the area, in the Middle East. So Saudi Arabia is a big country that we have a lot of dealings with. They are an ally, for a lack of a better term. We do sell them a lot of weapons. That's been a kind of controversial thing with their ongoing war with Yemen and us supplying them weapons. And I'm not making a value judgment on that one way or another, but that is something that's been in the news a lot and is something that people have debated about a lot. So Saudi Arabia is one of the world's largest exporters of oil. I think in the notes it says second. It used to say first when I originally wrote these notes. Yours will say second, but actually I think they're third now. I'd have to look that up for sure, but I think America actually surpassed both Saudi Arabia and Russia to become the number one exporter, or the maybe not exporter, but having the most oil being produced. And I believe Saudi Arabia is now kicked down to number 3. But they are one of the world's largest exporters of oil, and that is a lot of their economy is run off that oil, and that goes for many different countries in the Middle East too. That's a pretty common type of economic situation for them. It is a very oil-rich region, and so many of the economies in the area really run off that. Saudi Arabia is a monarchy, and they do, to a certain degree, run off of Sharia law, which is a religious law based on the rules in the Quran. Iran is also another country with a lot of Sharia law type things, and I would even go as far as say Iran is more of a theocracy, where the dominant religious leaders are the ones who are in control of the country. Going down to Israel. So Israel is a country with a pretty controversial past. So Israel and Palestine, which is what was there prior when the British had control over the area, the Palestinians were mostly Muslims, but there were Christians and Jews there as well. But under British control, there was a lot of influx of Jews coming in from Europe because of all the increasing anti-Semitism, and really ramped up around the time of World War II, with a lot of people choosing to move into Israel, and European Jews coming into living in Israel. And this pushed the Muslim people out of the region, and there are there's a lot of tension between those two groups. The Palestinians believing that their country was stolen from them, and many of them, basically living without a country, and then the Israelis, saying that this is their homeland, this is where their faith was based, and they have just as much claim to that area as anyone else. And of course today, now 60 some odd years later, most of the people who actually immigrated to Israel, those people have now gone, passed away, and the new generations, they've been born there. And so it's a very tough situation to say, who should have control over this area. And like most answers in most answers in history, it's whoever can hold it. And the Israelis have been very, very good at their military efforts to control Israel and maintain it, even with a lot of external attacks. There's been several wars where Muslim countries have even grouped together to try to defeat Israel and kick the Jewish population out of Israel, and that has not gone well for those Muslim countries. So Israel is a Jewish-controlled country. I would not say it is a theocracy, although much of their ideology does come from their religion. It is not a theocracy. So it's a little background on the, make sure you read through that. And I just kind of want to skip down. I don't have too much time to talk about everything in the notes. Arab Spring. So the Arab Spring was something that happened around 2010. So maybe a little bit dated for you now, but we're getting into some pretty recent history. That's only 10 years ago. You guys were alive for this. You probably don't remember it, but you were alive for it. And there was a lot of hope around the Arab Spring that this was going to be a big change for the Middle East. That all these countries, many people were protesting and demanding reforms, and many people were asking for more democratic styles of government. And people really felt like this was going to be a huge power dynamic shift in the region, including myself. I was very excited for this. I thought maybe that this would be turning over a new leaf for the Middle East, and that things would be better in that region after this. Some improvement was made, but expectations definitely beat reality in this case. 10 years later, and there are limited improvements in the area. Some countries even, I would say, going worse. Some countries getting better. And some countries still undergoing the conflicts that were started way back in 2010. So it's a difficult thing, and only time will tell. 10 years is not that long a time in the scope of history, so maybe it will have still more benefits in the future, but we shall see. So the Arab Spring, it all began when a street vendor had his cart taken from him, and he decided to self-immolate, which is to set yourself on fire in protest of this. And people used that as a rallying cry, and really felt that message, and felt their governments had been too restrictive. And this really kicked off a lot of protests for a lot of different reasons and a lot of different slights in countries all over the Middle East. And quite a number of governments were overturned because of the Arab Spring. But even those that were overturned and replaced with something else, not all of them were better. Some of them were basically the same. Some of them were worse, and a few were better. So it's hard to say. It really is, as to how great the positive effects of it are. So a couple of countries, I get into the background of what's going on there. Syria is a big one. That's one I was talking about, how some of these conflicts are still ongoing, and Syria is still one of those countries where this conflict that started in the Arab Spring is still ongoing today. And this is where you hear of the refugee crisis that's going on in Europe, where a lot of Muslim people are immigrating into Europe. That is a lot to do with the wars in Syria, people trying to flee those combat zones. So Syria is a very problematic area, and their leader is not giving up power, and the protesters did not overcome his military power the same way that did happen in some other countries. So moving on to Russia. So Russia, we're only going to talk about basically the last 100 years of history for Russia. So 1917, we already know the Bolsheviks took over, and that starts the communist road for Russia. 1922, the USSR is established. That is the Russia as we knew it for 1922, obviously all the way up until 1989, 1990-ish, when Russia finally fell apart, and or the USSR finally fell apart, and all of those territories that Russia had gained during World War II and the times after that have been separated into their own countries since. So, moving on. So Russia has a command economy, or a communist economy, where a lot of their industry is owned by the government. Although, just like China, they found out that, hey, communism actually doesn't work that well, and they have developed more and more and more capitalist ideas into their socialist or communist economy. And so they have slowly been inching back towards capitalism, although it's never probably going to be fully capitalist, simply because the people who are in power, part of the way they hold on to power is having all that control over the economy and controlling all of those things, and they're never going to completely give that up. So there's a lot of corruption in Russia. There's a lot of assassinations and a lot of sketchy things going on in Russia. More recent history, one of the things that they got into was invading Crimea, which was a peninsula on Ukraine, which used to be part of the USSR, but when it became its own country, 25 years later, after it became its own country, Russia reinvades that peninsula and adds it back into their own territory, and that is highly controversial. Obviously, the Ukraine was not okay with that. America condemned the actions, but ultimately, much like the beginning of World War II, the world didn't have much to say or do about it. When that first happened, I was very worried that it was going to be a similar situation and Russia was going to progressively push farther and farther. I'm still worried about that to a degree, but it's 5 years later and not much else has happened. Maybe Russia is trying to play a smarter game and doing it more slowly over time, but we'll see. History is very hard to tell the closer you get to the current day, because you don't have enough time to really have all of the sources, have all of the information, and have enough time for everything to play out. So, I then go into a discussion about a lot of the leaders, like Lenin the first, Stalin, who came after him, who was really influential in the USSR and how and our relationship with it in the Cold War, which is the next section we're going to talk about, our last section actually, before we are done with this class. So Stalin is very influential. We have Khrushchev and Gorbachev, and many other leaders throughout Russian and USSR history here. So the Russian Federation, as we know it today, Russia, 1992 is the official creation date for the Russian Federation. And so that is honestly not a terribly long track record, although they're more or less the same as the USSR, just with less territory. There were some reforms, but not many. Going on down, we have Siberia, and Siberia is this area in Russia. Russia is actually is the largest country on Earth in terms of size. It's about half the U.S. population, a little bit less than half even, but it is much larger than the U.S. Largest country on Earth, but much of its territory is inhospitable, and a lot of that inhospitable area is Siberia, which is a wintry desert. There is not much snowfall, or not much rainfall, which would come down in the form of snow. And it is, even though it is wintry and there's, permanent permafrost on the ground, it's still classified as desert because of that limited rainfall, limited precipitation, I should be saying. So Siberia is this massive piece of land, and Russia today, there's a lot of things that Russia has been getting into. They love meddling in elections all over the world. And not always with the intent of creating or electing a certain candidate, but also just with sowing discourse, or not discourse, but sowing the seeds of problems between different sections of America. They like it when we are fighting within and fighting each other instead of focused on other threats, like the things that they're doing, like taking over Crimea. And so that's been one of their biggest weapons, is sowing a lot of sowing the seeds for a lot of problems in America and in other countries as well, getting us to focus on our problems with each other instead of international problems that may be actually more important. So that covers Russia and the Middle East. Make sure, again, you look at those notes, because there are some things that I skipped, but I don't like it too much when these videos get too far over 20 minutes. I hope you guys are having a great time. Bye.